Since when do you date? Damian Blackwood's voice was quiet enough that the crystal glasses on the conference table didn't even tremble, but the entire room somehow felt colder the moment the words left his mouth, and I knew, before I even turned my head, that the question wasn't really a question at all. I was standing just inside the boardroom doors with Ethan beside me, my tablet still tucked under my arm, the polished walnut table stretching nearly 20 feet across the room and reflecting the city lights from the floor-to-ceiling windows behind Damian's chair, and for a second no one spoke, not the investors, not the lawyers, not even the assistants along the wall who normally moved like quiet shadows during Damian's meetings. Damian didn't raise his voice, didn't slam a hand on the table, didn't even look angry. That was the part that made the air feel so thin. He simply looked at Ethan, then at me, his dark eyes unreadable, his pen hovering an inch above the contract he'd been signing when we walked in. Damian Blackwood controlled half the shipping routes on the East Coast and more businesses than most people could list in a minute. But the thing about him that people learned quickly, usually the hard way, was that he never wasted energy on dramatic reactions. Silence was always worse. I cleared my throat softly, trying to keep my voice steady even though my pulse had suddenly started pounding like I'd just run a mile uphill. Mr. Blackwood, this is Ethan Reed, I said, keeping the tone professional, the same calm voice I used every morning when organizing Damian's schedule down to the minute. He's the consultant I mentioned earlier this week. Damian's gaze lingered on Ethan for another slow second, like he was cataloging details the rest of us couldn't see. The expensive watch on Ethan's wrist, the confident posture, the way he stood just slightly closer to me than a stranger normally would. Then Damian placed the pen down on the table with a quiet click. No anger, no surprise, just that same controlled stillness. Interesting, he said softly. Around the room, people shifted in their seats, the way they always did when Damian paused like that, because everyone who worked with him long enough understood the pattern. The quieter he became, the more carefully you needed to choose your next move. I had worked for Damian Blackwood for almost 2 years, long enough to memorize the rhythm of his world. The early morning calls from London, the late-night strategy meetings that stretched past midnight, the quiet instructions delivered in a tone so calm you didn't realize you'd just been given an order until you were already following it. What I hadn't memorized was this version of him, the one whose eyes had just turned as cold as winter glass the moment he saw the man standing beside me. Ethan extended his hand politely across the table, the confident smile he always wore still in place. Mr. Blackwood, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Damian didn't take the hand. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, the city skyline glowing behind him, and for the first time that evening his attention shifted fully to me. Just a glance. Quiet. Controlled. But the message in it was clear enough that my stomach tightened instantly. Then he looked back at Ethan and said the same words again, just a little slower this time, like he was testing the weight of them in the room. Since when? Damian repeated softly. Do you date? The room stayed silent. But the moment his eyes returned to me, something colder than anger settled behind them, and I suddenly remembered the warning Damian had given me exactly 48 hours earlier, spoken in the same calm voice, while handing me a file across his desk. Don't trust strangers who show up too easily. At the time I thought it was just another one of Damian's rules. Now, standing in that room with Ethan beside me and Damian watching every movement like he already knew the ending of a story the rest of us hadn't even started reading yet, I realized something that made the air feel even thinner than before. Damian Blackwood wasn't surprised to see Ethan Reed. He had been expecting him. The silence in the boardroom did not break all at once. It dissolved slowly, like frost melting under sunlight that nobody had noticed entering the room. Damian Blackwood glanced once more at Ethan Reed, and then toward the investors seated along the long walnut table. And with the same calm tone he used when discussing quarterly shipping forecasts, he said that the meeting would continue tomorrow morning. Chairs moved carefully against the polished floor, papers slid quietly into leather folders, and within less than 60 seconds the room that had been full of people with opinions, contracts, and questions became almost empty. No one argued with Damian Blackwood's decisions. Not in business, and certainly not in moments like this. When the last of the executives stepped out, the heavy doors closed with a soft click that echoed faintly in the tall room. Only 3 of us remained. Damian stood from his chair slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with the same deliberate motion he used before walking into negotiations worth millions of dollars. The city outside the windows shimmered with evening traffic 20 floors below, headlights flowing through Manhattan like thin rivers of white light. Ethan still stood beside me with the same composed posture, his expression polite, but I could feel a new tension in the space between the two men. Damien walked toward us at an unhurried pace, every step measured, as if the floor itself had been designed to move at his rhythm. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough that I could see the reflection of the city lights in his dark eyes. "Mr. Reed," Damien said calmly, his voice low but perfectly clear. "You arrived quickly for someone who was only introduced 2 days ago." Ethan did not seem offended. If anything, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, the kind of smile people use when they enjoy a quiet challenge. "Opportunity favors punctual people," Ethan replied. Damien studied him for another moment, not with hostility, but with the precise focus of someone solving a puzzle piece by piece. Then Damien's gaze shifted to me again. "Claire," he said, using the same tone he used every morning when handing me his schedule for the day, "walk with me." It was not a request. I followed him out into the long hallway beyond the boardroom, while Ethan remained inside, the doors closing gently behind us. The corridor outside was quiet, the kind of expensive quiet that came from thick carpets and walls designed to hold secrets. Damien walked toward the windows at the end of the hall, hands loosely folded behind his back. For several seconds neither of us spoke. I had worked beside Damien Blackwood long enough to understand that silence was often part of the conversation. Finally he stopped near the glass and looked out over the city. "How long have you known him?" he asked without turning around. 3 days, I answered honestly. "We met during the logistics conference downtown." Damien nodded once, as if confirming a detail he had already placed somewhere in his mind. "And in 3 days he has become important enough to escort you into my boardroom." His tone was still calm, but the words landed with quiet weight. I folded my arms lightly, more to steady myself than to appear defensive. "He offered to help with the supply audit you asked me to review. That is all." Damien finally turned toward me then, his expression thoughtful rather than angry, which somehow made the moment even more unsettling. "Claire," he said softly, "do you remember the rule I gave you 2 mornings ago?" Of course I remembered. The words had been simple and direct. Do not trust strangers who arrive too easily. At the time, I thought it was another example of Damien's cautious personality, the same instinct that helped him anticipate business risks before anyone else even noticed them forming. I looked at him carefully. "Yes," I said. Damien studied my face for a moment, then glanced toward the closed boardroom doors behind us. "Good," he replied quietly. "Because the interesting thing about Mr. Ethan Reed is not that he appeared suddenly." Damien paused there, his eyes narrowing slightly as though aligning pieces of information that only he could see. Then he finished the thought in the same calm voice. "The interesting thing is that he arrived exactly when I expected him to." And in that moment I realized something unsettling about the entire situation. Damien had not been surprised when Ethan walked into that room. He had been waiting for him. For several seconds, I simply stood there in the quiet hallway staring at Damien Blackwood, trying to decide whether he was serious or whether this was one of those moments when he was deliberately leaving half the truth unspoken. The lights of the city shimmered behind him through the tall glass windows, and the reflection made his silhouette look even sharper, like a figure carved out of shadow and steel. "You expected him," I repeated slowly. Damien nodded once, calm and precise, the same controlled motion he used when confirming a shipping route or approving a contract worth millions. "Not today specifically," he said, "but soon." I folded my arms lightly, partly because the hallway felt colder than before and partly because his answer raised more questions than it solved. "You were telling me you predicted that a man I met 3 days ago would walk into your boardroom tonight." Damien's gaze moved past me briefly toward the closed conference room doors where Ethan was still waiting inside. When his eyes returned to mine, they held the same steady focus that made senior executives twice my age suddenly rethink their arguments during negotiations. "Claire," he said quietly, "people do not appear around me by accident." The sentence landed with quiet certainty. I had worked beside Damien long enough to know he believed every word. For 2 years I had watched him anticipate business decisions weeks before competitors reacted, watched him read a room full of investors in less than a minute, watched him stop problems before anyone else even noticed they existed. But this felt different. He helped me with a logistics issue, I said carefully. That is how we met. Damien tilted his head slightly, studying me in that same analytical way he used when reviewing financial reports. Did he approach you first? He asked. I hesitated for half a second. Yes. Damien did not react with surprise. Instead, he looked back out at the moving traffic far below, the steady stream of headlights gliding along the avenue like slow white currents. That confirms the pattern, he said calmly. What pattern? I asked. He turned toward me again, and this time his expression softened just slightly, not warm exactly, but less distant than it had been a moment earlier. The pattern where someone appears helpful at exactly the moment you are under pressure. I felt a faint ripple of irritation rise in my chest. You are suggesting that a man offering assistance with a spreadsheet audit is part of some elaborate plan. Damien did not argue. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim black phone. With 2 quiet taps, he turned the screen toward me. On it was a photograph taken from what looked like a conference lobby. I recognized the setting immediately. The downtown logistics convention center where I had met Ethan Reed. The image showed the entrance hall crowded with people wearing badges and carrying coffee cups. But the camera had zoomed in on one person standing near the registration desk. Ethan. The timestamp in the corner of the photo showed a time nearly 20 minutes before I had even arrived at the conference that morning. I looked up slowly. You had someone watching the conference? Damien slipped the phone back into his pocket. I have people watching many places, he answered calmly. Especially when unusual names begin appearing in the same reports more than once. My eyebrows drew together slightly. What reports? Damien held my gaze for a moment before answering. The kind that track who is quietly asking questions about my company. The words settled into the air between us. Suddenly the entire situation felt different. You think Ethan came to that conference looking for you? I said. Damien did not hesitate. I know he did. A quiet pause followed as that realization settled in my mind. Down the hallway the elevator doors opened with a soft chime and then closed again somewhere out of sight. The building continued its evening routine like nothing unusual had happened. I looked toward the boardroom doors where Ethan was still waiting and then back at Damien. If you were expecting him, I asked carefully, then why let him walk into your building? Damien's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in his eyes that felt almost like satisfaction. Because, he said calmly, it is much easier to understand someone when they believe they are the one making the first move. Then he glanced toward the conference room again. And right now Mr. Ethan Reed believes exactly that. I watched Damien for another long second, trying to decide whether his calm confidence was reassuring or deeply unsettling. The hallway lights reflected softly across the polished marble floor, and somewhere behind us the low hum of the building's evening air system filled the silence. Damien Blackwood did not look like a man concerned about an unexpected visitor. If anything, he looked like someone who had already solved the equation and was simply waiting for the final variable to reveal itself. So what happens now? I asked quietly. Damien's gaze shifted briefly toward the conference room doors again. Now we allow him to continue believing he is ahead of the conversation. He straightened the cuff of his jacket with a precise motion before turning back toward the boardroom. I hesitated for half a second before following him. The heavy doors opened smoothly when Damien pushed them inward, revealing Ethan exactly where we had left him, standing beside the long conference table with the city lights reflecting across the polished surface. Ethan turned as we entered, the same confident smile still resting easily on his face, as though the last several minutes had simply been an ordinary pause in a business discussion. Everything all right? He asked politely. Damien walked past him toward the head of the table and rested his hands lightly on the back of his chair. Perfectly fine, Damien replied. His voice had returned to the calm professional tone he used in meetings, the one that never revealed what he was truly thinking. Mr. Reed, I understand you offered to assist Claire with our supply audit. Ethan nodded. Your logistics network is impressive, but even impressive systems benefit from a second set of eyes. Damien regarded him for a moment, and then something almost resembling amusement flickered briefly across his expression. You are correct. Efficiency is important. Ethan glanced toward me as if confirming that the conversation was progressing normally, but I could feel the subtle tension in the room again, the kind that builds quietly before anyone else recognizes it. Damien pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down with the same composed posture he always carried during negotiations. "Please," he said calmly, gesturing toward the seats across from him. "Let us continue the discussion." Ethan sat first, smooth and relaxed, while I took the chair beside him, setting my tablet carefully on the table even though I knew I would probably not be taking notes. Damien folded his hands loosely in front of him and studied Ethan with quiet patience. "Tell me," Damien said after a moment, "what exactly interests you about my company's logistics structure?" Ethan leaned back slightly, appearing thoughtful. "Scale," he answered. "Few organizations move cargo across the East Coast with the precision your company maintains. That kind of coordination attracts attention." Damien nodded slowly. "Attention can be useful. And sometimes profitable," Ethan added with a faint smile. Damien's eyes did not leave Ethan's face. "Sometimes," he agreed. The conversation continued like that for several minutes, calm and measured, two men speaking politely about shipping routes, data analysis, and supply chain redundancies. To anyone listening from outside the room, it would have sounded like a routine business exchange. But sitting between them, I could feel the quiet calculation behind every sentence. Ethan spoke with the easy confidence of someone who believed he understood the system he was studying. Damien listened with the patience of someone who already knew where every hidden door in that system was located. Finally, Ethan placed his hands lightly on the table. "Your assistant mentioned an inconsistency in one of your port distribution reports," he said. "I believe I can help identify where the inefficiency begins." Damien tilted his head slightly. "You believe you can?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." Damien considered that for a moment before leaning back in his chair. His gaze shifted briefly toward me again, just long enough to remind me of the quiet warning he had given earlier in the hallway. Then he looked back at Ethan. "Very well," Damien said calmly. "If you are going to examine my company's operations, you should see how they function up close." Ethan's expression brightened with interest. "That would certainly help." Damien nodded once. "Good." He rose from his chair and adjusted his jacket again with that same careful precision. "Then tomorrow morning you will accompany Claire to one of our port offices." Ethan's smile widened slightly, satisfied. "I appreciate the opportunity." Damien walked toward the conference room doors and paused with his hand resting on the handle. For a moment his expression returned to that unreadable calm I had seen earlier in the hallway. Then he opened the door and looked back at Ethan. "Mr. Reed," Damien said quietly, "I look forward to seeing what you discover." As Ethan gathered his briefcase and stepped toward the exit, I noticed something subtle in Damien's posture that I had learned to recognize over the past 2 years. It was the same stillness he carried just before a strategy unfolded exactly the way he had planned. And in that moment, I realized the meeting that had just ended was not the beginning of Ethan Reed's investigation into Damien Blackwood's world. It was the moment Damien had quietly invited him into it. I barely slept that night. Not because of Ethan Reed or the port visit Damien had scheduled for the morning, but because of the look Damien gave me right before we left the boardroom. It had not been anger. Damien Blackwood rarely wasted energy on anger. It had been something quieter, something measuring. By 7:30 the next morning the city was already alive with the restless rhythm of Manhattan traffic. Yellow taxis drifted through intersections like impatient bees, and the cold autumn air carried the distant sound of construction somewhere down the avenue. I stood outside the glass entrance of Blackwood Logistics holding a travel coffee that had already gone lukewarm, watching the reflection of the street ripple across the building's polished windows. Ethan arrived exactly on time. Of course he did. A dark gray sedan pulled to the curb, and he stepped out with the same relaxed confidence he carried into the boardroom the night before, coat neatly pressed, briefcase in hand. He spotted me and smiled easily as he crossed the sidewalk. "Good morning, Claire," he said. "Ready to show me how your empire moves cargo across half the coast?" I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "It is not my empire." Ethan glanced up at the building behind me. "Maybe not, but you seem to know how it runs." Before I could answer, the front doors opened behind us, and a familiar deep voice spoke from just inside the lobby. "She does." I turned immediately. Damien stood near the reception desk, already dressed for the day in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been tailored for him alone. His posture was relaxed, but there was something about the way he watched the street that made it feel like nothing within 100 yards could escape his attention. Ethan followed my gaze and offered a polite nod. "Mr. Blackwood, I did not realize you would be joining us." Damien stepped outside, the morning air stirring the edge of his coat slightly. "I am not," he said calmly. "Claire will take you to the port office in Brooklyn. I have other meetings." His eyes shifted briefly toward me. The look lasted less than a second, but the message was clear enough that I felt it immediately. "Pay attention." Then Damien turned his attention back to Ethan. "The office you are visiting manages one of our busiest distribution terminals. If there is inefficiency in our system, that is where it would begin." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Perfect place to start." Damien studied him quietly for another moment before stepping back toward the entrance. "Good," he said simply. "I look forward to hearing what you discover." The lobby doors closed behind him, and for a moment the noise of the city seemed louder than before. Ethan adjusted his briefcase strap and glanced down the street, where a line of traffic waited at the next light. "Brooklyn is about 20 minutes from here this time of morning," he said casually, "unless the bridge decides to disagree." I started walking toward the curb, where a company car was already waiting. The driver stepped out to open the rear door as we approached. "It usually behaves before 9, I replied. Ethan slid into the seat beside me, and the car pulled smoothly into the flow of traffic. For the first few minutes the ride passed quietly. The skyline drifted behind us as we crossed the East River Bridge, and the city slowly shifted from glass towers to older brick warehouses and narrow industrial streets. Ethan watched the scenery through the window like someone studying a map rather than simply enjoying the view. "You have worked for Damien a long time," he said eventually. 2 years, I answered. "That is long enough to understand how rare that is," Ethan replied. I turned slightly toward him. "What do you mean?" Ethan smiled faintly, but his eyes remained thoughtful. "Men like Damien Blackwood do not keep people close unless they are absolutely certain of them." The car slowed as we approached the entrance to the port facility, rows of cargo cranes rising against the gray morning sky like giant steel silhouettes. Trucks rolled steadily through the gates, carrying containers marked with shipping codes and distant ports from across the world. Ethan leaned forward slightly, studying the organized movement of the terminal. "Impressive," he murmured. Then he glanced at me again, that same thoughtful curiosity in his expression. "Tell me something, Claire," he said calmly. "When Damien warned you about strangers 2 days ago, did he happen to explain why someone might be interested in you?" The question landed quietly in the space between us, and suddenly the busy port outside the window did not feel nearly as routine as it had a moment earlier. I did not answer immediately. The question lingered in the quiet space inside the car while the port outside moved with steady mechanical rhythm. A long line of cargo trucks rolled past the security gate one after another, each one stopping for a few seconds before continuing deeper into the terminal. Cranes rotated slowly above the stacked containers, lifting steel boxes that weighed thousands of pounds with careful precision. Everything in the port followed a system. Schedules, clearances, routes. Nothing here moved randomly. I realized Ethan was still watching me, waiting. I turned my gaze toward the rows of containers stretching nearly half a mile along the water. "No," I said finally. "Damien does not usually explain his warnings." Ethan leaned back slightly in his seat, as if he had expected that answer. "That sounds like him," he said quietly. The driver slowed the car as we approached the main operations building, a long brick structure with wide windows overlooking the loading lanes. Workers in reflective jackets moved between trucks and forklifts while digital boards above the dock doors displayed arrival times and cargo numbers. The car stopped near the entrance, and the driver stepped out to open the door. Ethan and I stepped onto the pavement, and the air immediately smelled faintly of salt water and diesel from the nearby ships. Ethan looked around the yard with careful interest, like someone studying a complex machine rather than simply visiting a workplace. "You know," he said as we walked toward the entrance, "this place explains a lot about Damien Blackwood." I glanced at him. "How so?" Ethan gestured toward the container stacks rising like metal towers across the terminal. "Everything here moves because someone planned the pattern in advance." We stepped inside the operations building where the noise of the yard softened into the quiet hum of computers and radio chatter. Several managers sat at long desks monitoring shipping schedules on large digital screens, that tracked cargo arriving from ports across the Atlantic and the Gulf. A supervisor greeted us politely and led us to a glass-walled office overlooking the docks. From there, the entire terminal stretched out across nearly 40 acres of organized movement. Ethan placed his briefcase on the table and opened it slowly, removing a thin folder filled with printed reports. "Your audit mentioned discrepancies in shipment timing," he said calmly. "Let us start there." I pulled out my tablet and began reviewing the same reports Damien had asked me to analyze earlier in the week. For a few minutes, we worked quietly, comparing timestamps and container numbers while the port continued its steady routine outside the windows. Ethan studied each document carefully, occasionally making a note with a black pen. After several minutes, he stopped writing and looked up. "Tell me something honestly, Claire," he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "That sounds dangerous." Ethan smiled faintly. "Do you trust Damien Blackwood?" The question caught me off guard. Not because the answer was difficult, but because the way he asked it felt like part of a larger conversation I had not fully understood yet. I thought about the past 2 years. Early morning schedules. Late-night strategy meetings. The quiet way Damien noticed problems before anyone else did. The calm certainty in his voice when he gave instructions that always turned out to be correct. "Yes," I said simply. Ethan watched me for a moment before nodding slowly. "That makes sense." He closed the folder in front of him and walked to the glass wall overlooking the yard. Outside, a cargo ship was easing slowly toward the far dock, while cranes prepared to begin unloading the containers stacked on its deck. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the glass as he studied the operation below. "Because if you did not trust him," he continued quietly, "you would have already asked the question that everyone eventually asks about a man like Damien." I looked up from the tablet. "And what question is that?" Ethan turned slightly toward me, the faint smile returning to his expression. "Why someone as careful as Damien Blackwood chose you to stand at the center of everything he built." The words settled into the quiet office like a piece of information that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to appear. And for the first time since Ethan Reed walked into Damien's boardroom, I felt the strange sense that I might not be the only person in this room trying to understand the real reason behind Damien Blackwood's plans. I did not answer Ethan immediately. His question lingered in the air between us while the port continued moving outside the glass wall, cranes lifting containers slowly into the gray afternoon sky and trucks rolling through the lanes with quiet precision. For a moment, I simply watched the terminal, the rows of cargo stretching nearly a quarter mile along the waterfront like a giant steel puzzle that never stopped rearranging itself. "You are assuming I am at the center of something," I said finally. Ethan did not reply right away. He studied the activity outside with the same thoughtful expression he had worn since arriving at the port. "Claire," he said calmly, "men like Damien Blackwood do not place people beside them by coincidence." I felt a faint ripple of frustration in my chest. "I am his assistant." Ethan turned toward me slightly, resting one hand against the edge of the desk. "You schedule his meetings, control access to his office, filter information before it reaches him, and handle reports that many executives in his company never even see." His tone remained polite, almost conversational. "That is not a simple assistant position." I looked back down at the audit report on the tablet in front of me. The rows of shipment numbers blurred slightly as I tried to focus on them again. "You seem to have studied my job description more carefully than I have." Ethan smiled faintly. "Observation is useful in my line of work." Outside the office window, a cargo crane lowered a container onto the back of a waiting truck with careful precision. The driver pulled away slowly, merging into the steady flow of vehicles moving through the terminal. Everything here operated like clockwork. Damien's system. Damien's design. "What exactly is your line of work, Ethan?" I asked quietly. Ethan did not look surprised by the question. If anything, he seemed to have been expecting it since the moment we arrived. "Consulting," he answered calmly. "Mostly for companies that want to understand how large logistics networks operate." I studied him carefully. "That is a very broad description." Ethan nodded once. "It is also accurate." The faint smile returned to his face, but his eyes remained thoughtful. "The interesting part of my work usually involves identifying the person who designed the system." I leaned back slightly in the chair. "That would be Damien." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Partly." His gaze moved toward the shipping schedules displayed on the wall monitor beside the window. But every system eventually has a point where information flows through a single channel, a place where decisions become reality. I followed his gaze to the monitor, watching the blinking cargo numbers update every few seconds. And you think that channel is me? Ethan turned back toward me. I think Damian Blackwood trusts you with more than anyone else realizes. The words settled into the quiet office while the low hum of computers filled the background. For 2 years, I had never questioned my place in Damian's company. I organized schedules, reviewed reports, coordinated communication between departments. Important work? Yes, but still administrative in nature. Yet hearing Ethan describe it that way forced me to look at it differently. I remembered the private files Damian sometimes handed directly to me instead of sending them through his executives. The strategy documents he asked me to review before meetings. The quiet instructions he delivered late at night when the office was nearly empty. You are building a theory, I said carefully. Ethan nodded once. Yes. I crossed my arms lightly. And theories require evidence. Ethan stepped closer to the desk and tapped the closed folder beside his briefcase. Which is why I came here. I glanced at the folder and then back at him. To investigate Damian. Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. To understand him. Outside the glass wall, a ship horn sounded faintly across the harbor, deep and distant. Ethan watched me carefully, measuring my reaction. But the more I learn about Damian Blackwood, he continued quietly, the more I realize that understanding him may not be the real objective. I narrowed my eyes slightly. Then what is? Ethan held my gaze for several seconds before answering. Understanding why someone wants access to the one person Damian never allows anyone else to reach. The words hung in the air, calm but unsettling. And suddenly the quiet office overlooking the busy port did not feel like a simple workplace anymore. It felt like the center of a conversation that had started long before I realized I was part of it. The office grew quiet after Ethan finished speaking, the kind of quiet that made every small sound outside the window feel sharper. A crane rotated slowly across the harbor, lowering another container toward the waiting trucks below, and the faint echo of a ship horn drifted across the water again. I watched the terminal for a moment before looking back at him. You speak as if someone is trying to reach me, I said calmly. Ethan studied my expression carefully, almost as if he were deciding how much to reveal next. Someone always tries to reach the person standing closest to power, he replied. I shook my head slightly. That sounds dramatic. Ethan did not smile this time. It sounds realistic. He walked back toward the desk and opened the folder he had tapped earlier, sliding several printed pages across the surface toward me. At first glance, the documents looked like ordinary shipping manifests, rows of container numbers and transit codes. But a few entries had been highlighted in thin red ink. Look at the timestamps, Ethan said quietly. I leaned closer, scanning the page. The shipments were small, routine transfers between regional warehouses, nothing that would normally attract attention. But the timing patterns repeated in a way that felt strangely deliberate. Every highlighted shipment had passed through the system during the exact hours when Damian's executive staff usually left the office for the night. I looked up slowly. You think someone is testing the system? Ethan nodded once. Not testing the logistics network, he said. Testing the information flow. Outside the window, another truck pulled away from the loading lane, its trailer carrying a container bound for somewhere across the country. I glanced back at the paper. Why would anyone care about when reports are reviewed? Ethan rested his hands lightly on the edge of the desk. Because the person reviewing them might notice a pattern. The answer settled heavily in my mind. I had been the one reviewing those shipment reports earlier in the week. I had even flagged 2 of them for Damian to examine later. Suddenly, the entire conversation felt less theoretical. You believe someone expected me to see these discrepancies, I said slowly. Ethan held my gaze. I believe someone expected Damian to react once you noticed them. The room seemed to grow even quieter after that. I thought about the way Damian had looked at me in the hallway the night before, the brief glance that carried more meaning than any direct explanation. And you think that someone is you? I said. Ethan shook his head. No, his voice remained calm, but there was a seriousness in his expression that had not been there before. I think someone else started this chain of events. I simply followed the trail. I folded the papers back into a neat stack. That is convenient. Ethan accepted the comment without argument. It is also the truth. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The glass wall reflected the slow movement of cranes and cargo outside, while the computer monitors behind us continued updating shipment schedules every few seconds. Finally, I stood from the chair and walked closer to the window, looking out across the harbor. The air beyond the glass carried the pale light of late afternoon, and the distant skyline of Manhattan shimmered faintly across the water. "You said earlier that you came here to understand Damien," I said quietly. Ethan stepped beside me, but kept a respectful distance. "Yes." I crossed my arms lightly. "And now?" Ethan looked out at the port for a moment before answering. "Now I am beginning to understand something else." I turned slightly toward him. "What?" Ethan met my eyes with that same calm curiosity he had shown since the moment we met. That Damien Blackwood might already know exactly who started this. The words sent a faint chill through me. Because if Damien already understood the pattern forming inside his company, then everything that had happened since Ethan reappeared in my life might not be coincidence at all. It might be the first move in a plan Damien had been quietly building long before anyone else realized the game had begun. I stayed at the window for several seconds after Ethan finished speaking, watching the harbor move through its steady routine while his words settled quietly in my mind. If Damien already knew who had started the strange pattern inside his company, then this entire situation might not be a mystery at all. It might simply be the moment when pieces he had been watching for weeks were finally beginning to align. I turned away from the glass slowly. "If Damien knows," I said calmly, "then he would have already stopped it." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked back toward the desk and gathered the documents we had been reviewing, stacking them carefully into the folder again. "That depends," he replied after a moment, "on whether stopping it immediately serves his interests." The sentence hung in the air for a second. I frowned slightly. "You think he would allow someone to test his company just to see what happens?" Ethan slid the folder back into his briefcase before closing it with a quiet click. "I think Damien Blackwood prefers to understand the entire design before he changes anything inside it." Outside the office window, another cargo crane lifted a container slowly from the deck of the ship, now docked along the far pier. The entire port moved like a carefully designed machine, every vehicle following invisible instructions. Damien's world often worked the same way. I walked back to the desk and rested my hands lightly against its edge. "Then why bring you here?" I asked. Ethan looked up at me, the thoughtful curiosity still present in his expression. "That is the question I have been asking since last night." I tilted my head slightly. "You believe he invited you into this deliberately?" Ethan nodded once. "Yes." I considered that for a moment. Damien had not shown surprise when Ethan walked into the boardroom. If anything, he had seemed almost prepared for it. The memory of his quiet glance in the hallway returned again, that silent warning to pay attention. "If Damien wanted to study the person behind this," I said slowly, "he would not need you." Ethan smiled faintly. "True." He picked up his coat from the back of the chair and slipped it on before continuing. "But if he wanted to watch how that person reacts when someone else begins asking questions, then bringing me into the picture becomes very useful." The idea settled heavily in my mind. I looked down at the shipping reports again, at the small patterns Ethan had pointed out earlier. Someone had been moving shipments through the system at very specific hours. Someone who understood exactly how Damien's network functioned. "You were saying Damien may be waiting for whoever started this to reveal themselves," I said. Ethan nodded. "Exactly." For a moment the office was quiet except for the faint hum of the computers and the distant movement of trucks outside. Then the door behind us opened softly. I turned instinctively. A port supervisor stepped into the room, holding a small tablet. "Ms. Parker," he said politely. "A message just came through from the main office." My stomach tightened slightly even before he handed me the device. Damien rarely contacted the port directly unless something important had changed. I took the tablet and glanced at the short message displayed on the screen. It was only one sentence. "Claire, bring Mr. Reed back to the office immediately." The sender line confirmed what I already knew. Damien Blackwood. I looked up from the screen and met Ethan's curious expression. "That was fast," he said quietly. I nodded slowly. The timing felt almost too precise. "Damien wants us back in Manhattan now." Ethan studied my face for a moment before reaching for his briefcase again. "Then I suspect the next part of this conversation will be much more interesting." We walked out of the office together and stepped back into the busy courtyard where trucks continued moving containers through the loading lanes. The driver who had brought us from the city was already waiting near the entrance. As the car pulled away from the terminal, I glanced once more toward the rows of cargo stacked along the harbor. The entire visit had lasted barely 2 hours, yet it felt like we had just uncovered the edge of something far larger. Ethan remained quiet during most of the drive back across the bridge, watching the skyline gradually rise ahead of us. Finally, he turned slightly toward me. "Claire," he said calmly. When Damian Blackwood asks someone to return to his office immediately, it usually means he has reached a conclusion. I looked out the window at the city drawing closer across the river. Damian Blackwood rarely acted without a reason, and if he had already reached a conclusion about the strange pattern forming inside his company, then the moment we stepped back into his building there was a very strong chance he would reveal exactly what game had been unfolding around us all along.